Next guest is Scotty Aemis. He is passionate about helping parents navigate childhood trauma. After he and his wife adopted two children, they found themselves learning everything they could about helping their children thrive. Everything that felt instinctively right was actually not helpful for children trying to heal from trauma. That set him on a journey to develop his PSR, positive and safe relationships approach to parenting. It's helpful for all children and parents, but especially those navigating childhood trauma. Well, welcome to the podcast, Scotty.
Thank you, Dana. I appreciate the time and appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
Let's start off with the story of when you were in the trenches and managed to pull out.
Well, I wish I could tell you that, like my little bio there that said shortly after. Unfortunately, shortly after was years before we figured out what trauma was and figured out how to get out of the trenches. We as you had read, we adopted a brother and sister from a baby home in Russia and brought them home and thought that was it. I thought that everything was going to be wonderful and perfect, and we'd go through school and first through 12th, and everybody would be happy and no problems ever again. And guess what? We were wrong. So it turns out that we weren't really trained. We didn't know anything about and weren't prepared for understanding what trauma was and how it works and things like that. So originally we did what we felt was natural. The more children act up and rebel, the more you want to have stricter codes and give punishments as necessary and rewards and the behaviors. And I think we couldn't understand why the consequences that we applied, good and bad, didn't work. Well, why don't they work? And it only took, and people, if they're interested, who can read it in my book, but it only took really 5 years later until we were ready in children's court. And by the way, everybody knows who has special needs kids or adopted kids with trauma, get to know their children's services group. I'm sure it's called different things in different states very well. I think they were on my first name basis with me by the time we got to schools, and they couldn't cope and they couldn't deal with it, and we didn't know what to do, and we would end up being in children's court, and the judge turning to us and said, "Is this really what you want for how to have your kids taken away from you?" And it was that shock that sent us into like, what do we do? We're lost. Everything we've been doing is wrong. And just so happened that we connected with a friend shortly thereafter who was a therapist and who was involved in schools and a school counselor. And he asked us, "Well, have you ever heard of childhood trauma?" They exhibit all the natural signs. And I kind of looked and said, "What's childhood trauma?" I mean, we all have trauma, and we're dealing with life. And she was talking about specific childhood trauma that we would now call a real brain injury, where the child's brain gets reconfigured. So when they interpret or when they see some sort of input, it immediately goes down to the amygdala or the reptilian brain, the lower brain, depending on what parents are used to calling it. And so everything becomes a fear or flight reaction. And that's a lot of that is because they can't trust their caregiver. The caregiver's either neglected or abused. Somehow they experienced a real negative experience in their life, and they can't trust the adults. And then on top of that, putting them in an environment like schools made it all the more difficult, because now not only are they having problems with their immediate caregivers, now they're being sent into the jungle, right? Where they don't know anybody on the bus, and then there's hundreds of kids in the school, and then they don't know the teachers, and there's 30 kids in that, 25 or 30 kids in the classroom. And what do you do? How do you act? And they're constantly in that I'll call it the reptilian brain, the amygdala, for everything, fear, flight, response. And then all of a sudden they can't learn. All of a sudden they can't do relationships. And basically, many schools, they're beginning to get trained now to some extent, but the response is, well, your child can't thrive. Your child can't work in the school. What's wrong? What's wrong with them? What's wrong with you? All these other kids can. And it's a really, really difficult situation for many parents. Many parents of special needs kids, sometimes, we think we're all on our own, right? We don't think that there's many of us until you realize there's like 15 to 20% of a typical school district families are on IEPs, not to mention 504s and whatnot. And all of a sudden you realize this is a major issue for schools. And how do they handle it? How do they build it? How do they grow? How do they work with these kids? Because by most states, they're required to take these kids and help them learn. What do you do? And that's what I eventually began to figure out and determine. And how do we heal from the trauma, and how can they thrive in a public school? Some of them can't, but that's the whole process, and that's the thesis of our discussion today in our book.
And you said that you've also followed a lot of the work by Bruce Perry. You mentioned the book "What Happened to You" that he wrote with Oprah, and
Yes,
how sending back kids back to school is kind of a re-traumatization. You
absolutely.
know, they go through the school day, they're ready to explode, kind of. Yeah.
And in detail, and let me know if I'm talking too much or going on too long. But what happens with our kids who the main issue is we're trying to get them to heal from the brain interpreting everything through that as we talked through the amygdala. We want them to get back up to the high brain or I'm sorry, the prefrontal cortex, so they can make decisions, rational, comfortable, so they can make so they can talk to their teachers and have reasoning as opposed to emotional breakdowns. So what happens in many school environments, what we found, what we learned, and what we personally experienced, is that everything, even in the best of interest, we're sending our kids off to a bus, and all of a sudden there's, one bus driver who's focused on the street on driving, and 25, 30 kids loud, singing up and down, yelling. Boom, they're getting re-traumatized. They're getting off the bus. They might be sitting in an auditorium or in the hallway waiting for their teacher in a line, ready to go. Again, not much oversight. They're in a classroom of 25 or 30 kids. Where do they sit? Who's reacting? Who's making fun of them? Who's ignoring them? How are they feeling? Kids can be very tough to kids that don't seem to be normal like them, as they would sit. Then they go to lunch. Very few caregivers are in that lunchroom, right? Even when they have assigned seats at a table. Then they go to the playground and have a break. By this time the child is so out of sorts, he's never going to learn. And teachers are wondering, well, little Johnny isn't learning. Little Johnny isn't learning his numbers and letters. What do you do? How do you handle this? And that was our big problem. And that's when we learned the process. And like, as you mentioned, Bruce Perry is the neuroscientist that we follow. He has a couple of other famous books. I think his first one was the boy who thought he was a dog, and whatnot from there. And there's other neuroscientists as well. And they're basically have defined that the key to all trauma is through relationships. And my program is called Positive Safe Relationships, but it's based on the concept that the child will heal over time, their brain will heal over time if you can create an environment for them where all their interactions are positive and safe. So it's a very simple concept, but it's a very difficult to implement because how do you control these environments for their kids? That's the big challenge. For mine, what we found out was I took them to an alternative school. I have their vest on right now, called Lakeside, in our area. The school that works with all the school districts in the Philadelphia area, and they have a specific program to help kids with trauma. I'm sure there's also schools where kids with that are on the spectrum, and other programs as well. But this specific program has a curriculum with focus on trauma, helping to redirect those problems with the emotions and dealing with the reptilian brain, helping them calm, helping them build a process over time where they can rationalize and make decisions in a reasonable process, and then eventually return to public school. For example, my kids are now in 12th grade in public school, and they can handle it, and they can deal with it, and they're learning, and now they're even looking at going to college. 5 years ago, I would never thought in a million years they're going to go to college. But that's the success story, and that's the story I want to get out to your listeners, is that there is hope. and that we can all work together. There's programs out there, and that the schools want to help. And sometimes, sometimes it's an alternative school, sometimes a school, something in the school, public school. But either way, there are programs out there for your children.
Talk to me a little bit about the role counseling plays in parenting through childhood trauma and some of the things that you found out with the focus in public schools on kids on the spectrum rather than so much kids who have background trauma.
Great, all good questions. So first of all, I just want to bring up something that we use oftentimes, and we use in our schools. It's some people know the term, the three R's: regulation, regulation, relationships, and then reason. Meaning, oftentimes a child gets dysregulated, and we've all seen it to some extent. Kids with trauma are constantly dysregulated and upset and angry because that's the way their brain is working. And that we as adults tend to think that the first thing we got to do is jump in there and tell them what's right and what's wrong, and get them to understand from a rational point of view or a reasonable point of view what they should do, and they can't handle it. And so what Lakeside and what schools focus on trauma do is you got to first work on the regulation. If you work on the regulation, then you work on the relationship. It's a 1, 2, 3 process. Then work on the relationship. Once they trust you, then you can go back and begin to ask them, what should we do? What could we do differently? How can we handle the situation in the future? What kind of things can we do? What kind of coping skills do you want to work on when you feel this being upset? And so that leads into the counseling end of things. And what we found over time, both in school counselors and out, and our own counselors outside, the PT, the OT, the mobile therapists, the HSBC in our area, that oftentimes that many different counselors, and maybe your listeners will find this as well, have different trainings, have different specialties and different interests. And then we're bringing them into our home, and then they're giving us advice about what to do with our children, how they interpret the world. Like that old saying, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And so what we found, especially in the early years, is that we were following, 3 different directions of our counselors. And we were wondering, well, why aren't they getting better? And we realized that, part of it was our fault, because going 3 different directions, because we didn't give them an idea of what we were looking for in a counselor. So what I also often counsel our parents is the first step, you understand that you're the parent, you're in charge. Counselors, to make a reference, I hope this isn't insulting, or like accountants and lawyers. They're fantastic. They're important. They're critical. They have to be on board with your direction and identity, what you want for your child. In our case, because it was trauma, we needed counselors that were trained in trauma, understood trauma, and could demonstrate that with our children. That was a big turnaround for us, because all of a sudden, every situation where the kids were in, they were being treated with the same program over time. Relationship. And that was very important. What we found in schools is that, and I give the program people that are on the spectrum great credit, because they've developed the program and the needs of how to work with kids on the spectrum throughout the country. So many, almost all in school counselors have that training, behavioral modification, BMA. So it's a lot of different names for it. What we found, though, is it doesn't work with trauma, because it focuses on behavior rather than on relationship. And so our schools were applying a behavior management program, and it was getting rejected and not working for our kids. Again, we only learned afterwards that that's our fault. I mean, we need to inform our schools through our IEP, through our counseling system, about the right system, and they're usually open. I mean, I have found that they're open to other strategies, other ideas, other trainings, if you can give them an idea and a better understanding of what's going on with our kids. Like I said, when you're talking about 15 to 20% of the families on IEPs, that's a lot for public schools to handle. And how do they do it? All the different areas. So on that end, what we found is it was very important for us to find the right program. And in our case, it was our lakeside schools. They run their own. We run our own schools. I'm on the board of directors there now. We run 4 of our own schools where schools can send their kids over to us. We also have counselors in school of the public schools, so they can get direct trauma trained counselors for students that aren't going to go to be out of a public school, but are going to stay there. And we also do trainings for teachers, actually worldwide, but anywhere in the country. We'll provide trainings and whatnot for teachers to get an idea of how to handle trauma and how to look for it and how to identify it. Yeah, that was helpful.
Yeah, so when parents are working with either the community or these outsourced therapists like the OT and the PT and behavior, maybe if they have a child on the autism spectrum as well, how do they create that safe environment for their kids at home if they are encountering like a re-traumatization at school? So what can
Sure.
parents do more at home to help heal the trauma?
Right. So one of the counselings I teach our parents is that, one, you can't fix your child.
Yes.
You can create an environment where they can heal, but you can't fix them. And if they're constantly getting re-traumatized at school, you're going to only get limited success by creating a program at home that helps them, because they're going to get re-traumatized the next day at school. So what we counsel our parents is understand trauma and understand how to heal it. And what we're looking for is an overall environment where the child can feel safe in that environment wherever he goes. And the first place is at home. The caregiver or caregivers, whoever's at home, create that environment by in the home first by implementing the strategies of trauma. We're not getting upset. We're not going to let our buttons get pushed. We're going to create an environment where it's calm, where we're under control, where there's not a lot of electronics. I think that's a big no-no. I mean, it's a no-no for everybody, but especially for kids with trauma, because they'll lose connection with people. The other side of why relationships are so important is that kids need to be able to be in connection with other adults and kids in order to grow and heal. And things like electronics is going to be a problem. Anything with high amount of stimulus, we want to take away or reduce as much as possible. And then once we create that environment at home, then we want to try to duplicate that wherever they go. And that could be in-laws and grandparents and as well as school and the soccer program and Boy Scouts and dance and churches. No matter where they go, how do you do that? Well, it's really hard. You might have to choose different programs based on who the leaders are, who will listen to you, who can implement the strategy that you're providing them, or you may just not be able to go into some of these events. I mean, we personally had to not. There were a number of family dinners, Thanksgiving or whatever, that we just couldn't subject our kids to because, it's high intensity arguments, yelling, football, the whole thing. And it's just too much stimulus for the kids. It'll set them off. And again, we're looking for long-term, day after day, creating over time a healing environment. And it's not easy, but we can do it if we're willing to make that commitment.
So you've talked to me a little bit in the pre-chat about how schools often have a resolve room, a dysregulation room, those types of places. But those are often in elementary schools. And why are these spaces missing in secondary schools? And the behaviors come out a lot of times even more in secondary schools. So what can you maybe tell district leaders who are listening about just the need for more of these resources as well at the middle and high school?
Yeah, and it's the resolve room is amazing. I mean, they'll see the number of ISS, in school suspensions, detentions, sending them down to the principal's office, reduced by 80, 90%, because once you create an environment for the kids to regulate. because they're getting dysregulated, not because they want to, they're getting dysregulated because that's what their brain is telling them, that they're not safe. And you're right, there's many places that are trying to institute it at the younger ages, but especially since post-COVID, they've had 2 or 3 years of being locked in the house, and oftentimes these homes are not a great environment, and they've had a long time of not feeling safe, and they've all of a sudden being thrown into these schools, both elementary and middle school, junior high, and then eventually high school. And the kids aren't prepared for it, aren't ready for it, are upset. And then they're acting completely out of whack, out of problems. They're upset. And what do the school teachers do? They don't know how to handle it. They're dealing with 25 other kids. So the issue is they immediately go to some sort of punishment, some sort of difficulty, some sort of, grow up, do your thing, do properly. But again, it's not a choice. It's I call it a brain injury. Others would call it a condition, but it's a situation where we have to understand and create that environment for that resolve room. It doesn't have to be anything special. It usually is just a room where they can talk and make a case to a person that they trust, who's there consistently, and they can calm down and then have that relationship. And then they go back into class again. That's not that hard. We just have to be willing to do that.
Would you say maybe having like what we call a student advocate in some schools, which is kind of like a dean of students, would that be a place where they just are able to talk and that trusted adult, or maybe just being able to go to the counselor, like you said, somebody who's willing to and has the time to talk through that with them for 10 to 20 minutes or so?
Sure, or really whatever amount of time it takes to work on to get regulated again. It could be that in-school counselor, if they understand what trauma is and what the goal is of that conversation. It could be, as you call it, dean of students or an ombudsman or some other role. It usually helps if it's the same person. So the consistency where over time it's not just calming down, but it's also trusting the person that they're with. And if they know that they're going to, Mr. Tim or Mr. Steve or Miss Susan, whatever the person is, they know that they'll feel safe and they can just over time calm down. The person will then ask them about what coping skill they could use, because if they can feel something negative coming on, what should they be working on? And then they can talk to the teacher, say, hey, little Johnny, he needs to work on his spinner. This is what he uses to calm down, or his rain balloons, or whatever other program. Maybe he needs some sort of sewing or Legos, or can he go in the back room and just create something? Oops, sorry about that. Create some time on his own to calm down, to regulate, and to build resilience. And over time, that's what we're looking for, because right now they can't cope consistently with what's going on, and that's okay. That's the other thing we have to deal with. It's okay, but parents need to build that into their IEP as well.
Well, what if
that's also not easy.
Yeah, what if the student doesn't have an IEP? I mean, there are a lot of schools that have parents that are migrants, and they might be coming from a different country, and they're recently arrived. Yeah, and so and then they have these trauma backgrounds and these behaviors that are occurring.
Yes.
So how if the student hasn't been identified for having a need to get an IEP, how can schools help support those students?
Well, it's a challenge because I know from where we are over again near Philadelphia, but I'm sure many big cities are the same. Even kids who can't get a decent meal every day can develop a trauma from that. I mean, that's traumatic in itself when they don't know if they're going to have a meal, and all of a sudden create learning issues and problems and emotional outbursts and whatnot. And one of the tough things with many public schools is they have a lot of things going on, and they have a lot of stresses going on, and oftentimes they're not looking for a solution for one child. That's why it's so important. That's why I'm out here talking to you and other people that will have their audience and saying, hey, it really is going to end up being the parent or a counselor telling the parent, hey, have you thought about this? Go get your child checked, um, uh, get a diagnosis. With a diagnosis, you can get the IEP, at least a 504 at the bare minimum, and start with that and build a program from there. Because my experience, and hopefully maybe there are many schools that are much better than the ones I've seen in the East, aren't looking to create special programs for kids that don't necessarily have the IEP or the 504s built in. If the counselor picks it up and notices it, that'd be great. But again, a lot of times these counselors are seeing, have representation of a couple hundred kids. How do they know if it's just an outburst? How do they know? It's us, the parents. We have to take the lead, and it's hard.
Yeah, and that's difficult. Like you said, if there's a lot of students per each counselor, or there are parents who are, you know, coming
Don't know about it.
from other countries, or they're just kind of passing through for a period of months, and interrupted education or lack of resources to medical support. So I think, at least like you said, having a place in the school where students are able to have that trusted adult they can talk to or work on coping skills. Definitely need more personnel at schools to be able to talk with kids, because from my experience, when you see behaviors outbursts in classrooms, it's not necessarily due to peer conflict or just something that the teacher is teaching the student doesn't like. It has to do with what they're already experiencing throughout the day when they arrive to the classroom.
Very, very true. I know many of the kids at our school come from broken homes, come from homes where parents might be incarcerated or having their own drug issues. I mean,
Yeah.
you almost don't expect these kids to be able to handle it without some help and some idea. That's why, that is why, to some extent, counselors on the lookout, having in-school counselors, are so important, because they can hopefully pick up some of these signals and then connect back to the parents, or at least work with the child in terms of, well, what do we need? What do you need? What are your issues? When do you find upset? Why are you having problems with your peers? All these questions that kids, they'll share, that especially at the younger ages, if you're asking them questions and making them allowing them to feel safe. But yeah, that's one of the big issues is that the schools aren't staffed to identify and focus these various issues for kids, and then what to do about it. How do they know if it's trauma versus something else? That's where the parents need to come in, or professionals need to come in and diagnose.
Well, we've had a great conversation today around your experience with your own children coming from a children's home in Russia, and how you navigated their trauma, and now they are thriving, soon to be adults, and also what the positive, safe relationships approach is, and so much more. Out of everything we talked about, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
The number one thing I want your listeners to really take from here is that, I guess, is the concept of hope. So many of us parents feel like we're in the middle of this. They think our kids have rad, or they think our kids are lost and they don't know what to do, and they come home and press our buttons, and we think we're never going to get out of this, and we're angry at them, and we're angry at life, and we don't know what to do. And I'm here to let them know there is a pathway forward. There is a method that works. There is a way of them healing and you healing as well, if you're willing to pursue and understand what trauma is and how to work with it, and realize that two kids can experience the exact same traumatic event, and one have no issues whatsoever, and the other one have deep trauma from it. And And it's not one is faking, one is not. It's just the way it is. Two different people will interpret it two different ways. And it's just not, it's also, it's not just what your brain does, but it's emotionally felt throughout the whole body. And these kids will get re-triggered very easily. And it's re-triggered because it's a real trauma and it's real something we can do. The other thing, the other thing I mentioned, I think I mentioned to you, I wrote a book that I'm not even a great author, but I wrote a book, put it on Amazon. I'm not a promoter, anything, but it ended up being #1 in 8 different categories. That's how I know this is a huge subject, and there's lots of parents out there who really need, if I can help them any way I possibly can. We have a website called Child Trauma Sherpa, or ctsherpa.com, as well as a Facebook group and Instagram. And we put out lots of blogs and for more information for parents who want to learn about it. And we have schools that, like I said, like Lakeside, who go out there and offer training. So if you find that your local school isn't giving you what you need, let us know. We'll put a word out. We'll contact the school on your behalf and say, hey, do you need some training? A lot of times, the school, the state governments have programs for training, the grants that they'll give the public schools for their teachers to get trained, and it's all free to them, and that's an important part too. There's lots and lots of public money out there for mental illness, and we just have to take the time to focus and figure out which ones are important for our kids. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yes, I was going to ask you where people can find you, but you listed that. You're on Facebook, Instagram, your website. I'll put all those resources, and also your one pager for people who like maybe to book you to speak or be on their podcast if they're listening. Put all that stuff in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for being on the Out of the Trenches podcast today. It was a pleasure talking with you, learning more about your experience and how schools and parents can work with kids who are experiencing trauma.
Thank you so much, Dana. I really appreciate it. Thank you.